I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day: does young Luke Skywalker's impulsiveness in the original trilogy make sense of the characterization of Luke that we see in The Last Jedi? Now, the reason I'm asking that question is because about a week or so back, I made a video responding to the claim that some apologists for The Last Jedi are now making that Luke's character is not inconsistent with what we saw in the original trilogy, and they try and claim that there is some consistency in his actions here. Now, in response to that video, one of my watchers posted a comment where they suggested that perhaps the consistency is found in the fact that the original Luke is impulsive. He's an impulsive character. He has impulsiveness about him, which we see in that original trilogy. And doesn't that therefore justify the concept of him standing over the bed of his young, sleeping nephew, contemplating murdering him in cold-blooded, premeditated murder with a lightsaber? Just like I responded in that previous video, I will say the same thing now. No, I don't think that it does this at all. First of all, it is correct to say that impulsiveness is a hallmark of Luke Skywalker's characterization in the original trilogy, especially in the first two films, and in particular the first film, A New Hope. That's where his impulsiveness is at its strongest. And when you think about the impulsiveness we see, obviously he's impulsive. He wants to rush off and to join the rebellion. When he's with Ben at Mos Eisley, there's an impulsiveness to him. He is also impulsive before that when they are back. He's rushing back to the family farm, to his aunt and uncle's place, and Ben tells him not to. Impulsively goes anyway. When they're on the Death Star and he's saving Princess Leia, it's his impulsiveness to want to do that. And then, of course, as they are fleeing and he sees Obi-Wan and Darth Vader in that final battle, he has an impulsive reaction. He rushes to help. It doesn't end there, of course. We see that really big moment of impulsiveness in The Empire Strikes Back. It's nowhere near as strong now, but it is still there. When he rushes off, he stops his training and he impulsively rushes off to save his friends on Cloud City. But this is the really important point about all of the impulsiveness we see, that particular hallmark of the character of Luke Skywalker in the original trilogy. It is always motivated by the good. Or there is a youthful context which makes sense of it. So he's young, and young people tend to be more impulsive. So there's a context given to it. But still, even in the youthfulness, it is always still an impulsiveness to do the good. It is not an impulsiveness to do anything. And certainly not an impulsiveness to do selfish or evil things. He wants to help. He wants to make things better. He wants to do good and righteous things. He's not impulsive to do something evil like kill another person. Now, even accepting all of that and that impulsiveness that's part of his character, particularly in the first two films, that completely changes by the time the Return of the Jedi arrives. Because in Return of the Jedi, we now have a Luke Skywalker who right from the very beginning is composed, he is controlled, he is forward-thinking. This is a new and far less impulsive Luke Skywalker. Of course, there is one big final test to go, though, and that final test happens with the Emperor and Darth Vader in the final act of the film on that Death Star, and he is tempted in that moment under all of that extreme temptation and pressure from the character who is effectively Satan in this story, the Emperor, to give in to his more base desires and to just brutally kill his own father, but he doesn't. He stops. Now, there is a sort of foreshadowing about that impulsiveness that we see in the shuttle ride as they're heading to the moon of Endor, and he realizes that his presence can be felt by Darth Vader, and he tells the rest of the crew, he says to Han and Leia and the rest of them that he shouldn't have come, that he's endangered the mission. And there's sort of a foreshadowing, a little moment of impulsiveness there of what's to come, the really big test. Will he give in to his base desires, which of course he doesn't do. He doesn't surrender himself. He actually throws down his lightsaber and says, "I will not do evil that good may come of it." It's the exact opposite of what we see in Luke Skywalker and The Last Jedi. I will refuse to do this evil act, even though it might produce a good outcome. He is not going to give prey to utilitarianism, to consequentialism. He's never going to allow the end to justify the means. And in that moment, what happens is, this is effectively the character of Luke Skywalker becoming ordained. This is the completion. This is the final seal on his training. His character arc is now complete. It has come to fruition, to fullness. He is now a Jedi Master, a true Jedi Master who has taken control. There is no more of the old Luke, whatever little bit of it was left, the young, impulsive guy. This is now someone who has that mastery that you would expect of a fully trained and properly connected with the Force Jedi like Luke Skywalker has become. Now that is not what we see in The Last Jedi, though. And there is also some context and some other points that really matter here in regards to his impulsiveness. So, you could perhaps pose the question, maybe his character would go back to his old impulsive ways, though. Could that not happen? Well, first of all, this is now a much older and wiser Luke Skywalker. Effectively, he is like an Obi-Wan type character. Think about Obi-Wan in A New Hope. He's not an impulsive character, not in the slightest. And that's very much the mould in which Luke is now. He is the older guru. He is the source of wisdom. He is the master, the mentor figure in this story. And he is a lot older and a lot wiser. So it doesn't really make sense. On a natural perspective, from a natural perspective, people don't become more impulsive or revert to impulsiveness with age. With age, they mature into more of a temperance and a prudence. And so it just doesn't make any sense at all that an older, wiser character would now be doing this. But more importantly, and this is quite key, I would argue that it is not at all the hallmark of impulsiveness to stand over someone in their sleep and to contemplate murdering them in cold blood, premeditated, cold-blooded murder, in order that good may come of that evil act. That's not impulsiveness. That's something else altogether. That is a person who has lost their moral compass. That is a person who has lost all hope and who is given into despair. That is a person who has lost their way. And what's interesting too is that Rian Johnson has him with a lightsaber, contemplating murder with a lightsaber, the very symbol, the very, I guess, the tool of hope, the symbol of his transition and his journey as a character throughout his whole story and complete character arc, to be using that now and turning that as the source for evil. Now, he might like to think to himself, oh, there's a nice poetry to all of this, but it really doesn't make sense. It doesn't actually solidify that moment. It really makes it even stranger. So this is not an impulsiveness, someone who's rushing to do something without thinking. This is a person contemplating doing something because they have lost touch with their moral centre. That's a completely different thing altogether. Now, what we have here is a character, this idea of the cynical, jaded Luke, which potentially, I can see why you could say it has, perhaps there's something interesting about exploring that idea. I'm less and less convinced, though. In fact, I'm very strongly convinced that they should have never ever done this to the character of Luke Skywalker. I think what's happened here is, in typical modern filmmaking style, we have imposed our own cultural postmodern nihilism onto this pre-existing character. We have allowed our cynicism to actually colour and effectively destroy the character of Luke Skywalker, who was not a cynical, jaded, postmodernist, nihilistic character in that original trilogy at all. This is us imposing our own pathologies upon that character, and I don't think that's a good thing, because I think in mythology what should happen is these characters like Luke Skywalker, who is the sort of the pinnacle hero, what should happen is they shouldn't be infused with our own psychological issues and cultural confusions. They should stand as like a clarion call of truth and goodness and beauty. They should be a thing that sort of role models and calls us to something better, not something we take and then impose our own cynicism upon. Mythology should never be like that. I think it's a corrupting of mythology and mythological figures when you do that. Just imagine if we'd done that, say, with the Shawshank Redemption dimension. Let's say someone made a sequel and they went back and they gave us Andy Dufresne in this future setting where all of a sudden now he's just a wife beater and he's an alcoholic and he ends up killing himself in a state of absolute despair. Now, you could argue there's some sort of interesting creative concept to explore there, but it would be a particularly ugly thing to do. It would lack beauty. It would lack goodness. It would have just ripped the guts completely out of that mythology and the whole idea of hope and suffering with a focus of giving yourself to hope and never allowing the suffering to draw you into despair and darkness. All of that would have been destroyed if we'd done that. Now, that's very typical of the modern despairing culture we find ourselves living in these days, but it isn't good mythology. However, if they wanted to do that with Luke Skywalker, I don't think they should have, but let's say they wanted to do that, there's a whole lot of steps. I've said this before and I'll say it again. There are steps that are missing. Essentially, there is no character development that justifies what we see in The Last Jedi. What you needed to give us was some strong reasons and motivations which explain how that character of Luke Skywalker would find himself seemingly so suddenly standing over the bed of his young sleeping nephew, contemplating murdering him in cold blood, in premeditated cold blood with the lightsaber, the very symbol of protection and goodness in the galaxy. That isn't good writing. And I would suggest it's also falling prey to that cynical nihilism that's so much part of the postmodern trend. And I get it. We live in a culture now where we are cynical about moral people because a lot of our leaders, our political leaders, our religious leaders, our community leaders, our celebrities, our sports heroes, a lot of them have had some very public falling from graces. In many ways, we've seen behind the curtain. We've looked behind the wizard's curtain and we've seen a little man pulling the strings. And now we have this jaded cynicism that thinks that every person who shows traits of moral goodness is like a tall poppy that must be chopped down to size. And I think that's why Rian Johnson did this. I don't think it's good writing either way. Even if he had constructed a logical chain of characterization events and character development that had made sense of it, I still don't think it would have been a good thing to do. However, he didn't do that, and that makes the whole thing even worse. And that is the problem with the writing of the character of Luke Skywalker that we see presented in The Last Jedi. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comment section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on PayPal or Patreon. There is a link for both in the video description below. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily Question.